Welcome back, everyone, and thank you. I hope you all had a rich discussion in your small groups. And what we'd like to do now is hear back from our rapporteurs about the priorities that were set, the way you all invested your $10 million, and some of the reasons that surrounded where there was agreement and if there was disagreement, and if so, what that disagreement was about and why. So let me just begin by asking if there's a volunteer, someone who would like to go first. And let me just say, in the backdrop, I think we're going to be able to bring up the Google documents in which you all worked, just as a visual aid. If we don't get that to work, that's fine. But I think that we might be having that visual aid being brought up. Do I have a volunteer for one of the groups to go? Madeline, I see a hand. Great, thank you so much. You're on mute. Do you want to unmute yourself and talk us through your activities?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I was from group 1, and we had a couple of participants that were having a difficult time deciding where to allocate our money. But the first decision we actually came to was that education was extremely important. So yeah, we first decided that education was extremely important. And then we also sort of agreed that community media and civil society were both of importance. And although we had ranked them differently, we figured that those were the second priorities. And then finally, we said that the government agency coordination was of lowest priority. However, we chose to allocate the same amount of money, $2 million, to buckets 1, 2, and 4, because community media and civil society are very important, but government agency coordination ensures that they have the support to function, interact with each other in the community. And then finally, we gave education $4 million, and we were hoping to allocate this funding towards teacher and staff training and a redesigned curriculum that's more supportive of community and civic engagement, just because education is growing our future civic leaders, and having adequate training on civic engagement is going to help these people engage in their communities in the future. So the return on that investment will be extremely high. And that's sort of how we came to those decisions.
That's great. Madeline, do we understand you to say then that on the issue of education, there was agreement across the board? You didn't have any sort of debate around that? Was there resounding agreement on that?
Yeah, it was a resounding agreement, although there was one incredible point made by one of the group members that we need to be concerned about how the money is going to be an investment. Like, where is it going to go? Is it going to be a one-time spending, or is it going to continue to build returns in the community? And although teacher and staff training and maybe a redesigned curriculum might be a one-time investment, the impact it'll have on the culture of the education systems is extremely valuable. So.
Great. And if you would, where were the areas of disagreement or uncertainty? Can you describe a couple of highlights on that front?
Yeah, so I think our group had the most uncertainty in the specific types of entities we wanted to interact with, just because we were thinking more broadly about what an investment in that bucket could do. And so we had a bit of a struggle trying to decide what specific organizations would be most important or beneficial within each bucket. But we seem to be of a similar mindset for most of the exercise. So that was pretty cool.
That's great. Let me ask one more question, if I might. Did you notice any big gaps in terms of examples or forms of civic engagement? It sounds like perhaps that's not the case, but I want to check in with you on that. Did anyone say, hey, where's the X?
Actually, I think towards the end, one of my group members decided to stand up more for government agency coordination, because initially we were thinking we might have buckets 2 and 4 have 2.5 million and bucket 1 have 1 million. But then we had to sort of rethink about what the value of government agency coordination could bring, and that giving it one, it would be very impactful to give resources to the government so that they could help coordinate with the other services we want to fund. So.
That's great. So it sounds like the discussion enabled you all or kind of forced you all to talk even more deeply about what some of these types of civic infrastructure really are and mean and would look like, right? And
Exactly.
I'm glad you didn't invest 2.5 because that would have been breaking the rules.
Yeah,
You have to invest in 1 million.
in 1 million.
Yeah. Well, we've had deliverance break rules before, and sometimes it's very productive and constructive. So that's great. So I want to ask then the other four groups, does anyone want to go next? And I'm particularly interested in a group that may be prioritized in a really different way. Thank you. And Madeline, let me just say thank you. You did an excellent job. Does
I can go next, although we didn't really allocate much differently.
You do not. Well, let's go ahead and just leverage your willingness to go second, and I'll get more forceful and coercive after you report out. But okay, so Sophia, how did you all? Which group were you? And if we could bring that up, that would be great. If we could scroll.
So down. I'm in group 2.
Okay, group 2. And how did you all invest your $10 million?
So we didn't end up coming to an established consensus, but we had a really good conversation. We kind of ended up, agreeing that education is foundational. And so we wanted to allocate $4 million to education. We kind of differed on the different buckets, but I think it was actually good because at least I found myself towards the end realizing, I didn't think that government agency was as important until we had talked about, one of my group members had mentioned that the role of government and government having resources and like the actual ability to actualize goals and policy was really important. So we really should, pay attention to government agency coordination. So we kind of, played devil's advocate with each other. And I'd say like our biggest points of agreement were in the beginning, civil society was central. We really kind of stuck to the theme of education being, one of the front runners because someone in my group had brought up how, it mentions K through 12 and higher education. So if we invest a smaller amount in higher ed or in education, it's going to be spread out, and education is so important at all levels, even encouraging higher education. So we wanted to prioritize, giving the most amount of money to education. But then we also, I think where we, as I mentioned, disagreed the most was not the importance of the other 3 buckets, but just which, should we distribute evenly, like group 1? Should we give one a little bit more than another? I guess I'll just kind of hit on like where we all landed. So I mentioned how one of my group members brought up how important the role of government was, and that was something that I thought was really interesting. Also, this idea of, how if we invest in community media, it can enhance, community knowledge, community engagement. The last session that we had was talking specifically about how important it is to just make sure that, your community is being represented. So that also came up in our conversation about how important it was to invest in community media. But also, civil society, it may not have as strong of an infrastructure. So it may be good to invest more money into that to help build up an infrastructure and give, resources to, not-for-profits or other organizations that may need that extra boost to really become strong and influential. And I think something that was really impactful that we talked about was how interconnected all these buckets are. And I think that's kind of why we're really struggling towards the end of figuring out how exactly to allocate the money was, we see how community media connects to education, and disparities in education are perpetuated by community media or vice versa. And so that's something that I thought was really important too, was just how we noticed how interconnected all these buckets are and how we didn't want to pick one over the other, because we saw how this money could not only be impactful for one, but impact all of them. So yeah, I know we didn't come to a total consensus, but it was a really good conversation. And I think it really forced us to think about, you know, the importance of things that we may not have noticed before.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And, I'm noticing that you didn't put the dollar allocations up high, but there is some allocation, well, captured in the disagreement. But you all could agree on that 4 million for education. And I see below 4 million for government agency coordination, but that was just one person's view, it sounds like, or maybe a couple people's view. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was one person who suggested that, and then 1 and 1. We had a few, even splits across them. So I was just writing down kind of what other people had suggested. But that was one that was really sparked a lot of conversation too.
And sounds like there was some learning from each other as well as people began to press their points and their perspectives. It made people think, oh, I hadn't thought about this or that. How important, for example, as you said, government agency coordination is. Well, it's fascinating that thus far education is the big winner in terms of where there seems to be consensus. Can we move to another group? Do I have a volunteer? A group maybe that did not prioritize education as important. So we've heard from, who is this?
Anna.
Anna?
I'm with 3, so I'm also just keeping it nice and orderly.
Keeping it tidy.
So I'll start with that point about education. We actually did have a little bit of disagreement necessarily, but discussion about kind of the role of education in investment in it. So there was some folks who felt like education is really a kind of downstream effort if you're thinking about downstream versus upstream and prevention and where to put your dollars. Whereas some of the other buckets were more upstream. I'll speak for myself. I personally felt the opposite, that education is very upstream. It's kind of the most upstream thing I can think of, one of them. And so how can we, if we can invest there, as someone else said, you're really equipping kind of the civil leaders of the future. So there was some back and forth there about what that meant, but we did all end up agreeing that if you could focus on education as, sort of a potential for future earnings, that if you looked at it that way, it was important, as well as we all agreed that what was missing here was focus on early childhood. This looks like it's just K through 12, and then higher education, and that early childhood is really important. I think starting some of these inequities early on with those who have access to early childhood education and those that don't. And reading obviously is a really important skill, so we could all agreed on that. And then acknowledgement that there are different ways of learning and that it doesn't all happen in kind of formal institutions. And so if we could fund and invest in those mechanisms, right, we could all agree. So we did end up all agreeing that it is important, and we put 3 million to it, but there was some real discussion there. And then we started actually just by agreeing to put 2 in each bucket just as a starting place, and work from there. And the other place where there was a real conversation about where gets the other extra million was around the difference between government agency coordination and civil society, and basically whether to invest in government or in civil society. And that was kind of a real tension actually for us.
Can you get at what the kind of the underlying either evidence or values or what?
Yeah, I think
in that disagreement.
There was some folks who feel like, civil society and those organizations there are really working from a place of solidarity with the community. It's building power, and it isn't just service delivery, and that government can sometimes show up as, right, just the service provider or service delivery. And that these organizations, if you build kind of civil society, you are creating power and engagement in the other buckets as well. And so to the point about that these are interconnected, that if you focus there, it can impact the government agencies as well. On the other side, some folks felt like the government is a real important place, especially in terms of policy making, and that the alignment is really creating the place for some of this discourse and discussion, and that without the government acting in that way, that it might not exist. I don't know if I'm saying the right words of this person correctly, so I apologize. But just really highlighting the importance of the coordination. I think I'm hearing too some confusion between, is this funding the government or funding this coordination aspect, right? And so I just think that people might be a little confused about and myself included, right? What exactly this means to fund this. We're not taking money away from the government. It's about creating this extra coordination function, sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some ambiguity there.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say is there was a disagreement about, a discussion about whether you focus on kind of everybody and that a rising tide raises all boats, or whether you really should focus on those that are most marginalized, given the kind of profile of Arlandia and how there was those who have historically been kind of structurally disenfranchised. So that was another discussion that we didn't really land, but something that I think was important to highlight.
Yeah, that is very interesting about whether you do targeted investments or more universal investments. And I'm curious, if I may do this, just to circle back to Madeline and Sophia, did that surface in your groups as a point of discussion about whether these monies, there's the targeting of them in terms of allocating them, but did you get down into any more granular discussion about how to allocate within those allocations? And did you talk about this targeting versus more universal approach?
Actually, in a way we did. When we were sort of debating whether community media or civil society was more important, the one point that sort of came up was that although civil society is a great place for building community and encouraging people to take part in discussions, it's really important to have expertise in the exact community you're serving so that you can make sure that you're adequately addressing their needs. That's sort of where that conversation came in for us. I think we talked a little bit about how I think it mentioned that Black and Brown people were, of course, more represented and the percentage of people under the poverty line. And for that reason, we were hoping that community media would take sort of those resources and the money we allocated them to focus on more disenfranchised groups. But we also saw civil society as a venue for philanthropy as well, just because a lot of nonprofit and faith-based organizations direct their energy towards taking care of people in need. So that's how we thought about it.
Great, thank you. Sophia, did it surface in your discussion at all? This targeting on targeting
we definitely talked more.
You go ahead, sorry.
We definitely talked more broadly, but at least just in our discussion with civil society, we talked a lot about just helping to build up infrastructure for organizations and for companies. And so I think that's probably where we had focused on the most, was just talking about building infrastructure, and even for education too, just building it up to make sure that like foundation and everything there is strong before like specific targeting. So we kept it more broad, but did talk about the like severe importance of infrastructure.
Okay, great, thank you. Anna, before I leave, were there any final comments you wanted to toss out there from your discussion?
Nope, other than we ended up with sort of really spreading it across. Nothing super different from the first group. I wanted to do something a little bolder, but we wanted to make sure all of these buckets were funded because they all seem important. So
okay, Great. Well, thank you, Anna. I appreciate that excellent report. Now, Zoe, you're with us, and did we get our one reporter in the right room also, or yet, or not? I'm not getting an answer. So, oh, yes, we did. Great.
What are you looking for? I'm not clear what you're asking.
Oh, are you a rapporteur for one of the groups for 4 or 5, Sally?
Yes,
for 4. Excellent. Okay, so Sally and Zoe, you are the remaining 2 rapporteurs who are going to report out the discussion. Would one of you particularly like to go first? I'm particularly interested in which, if there's one of you that one of your groups that did something really different from what we've seen thus far, really prioritizing education and kind of allocating pretty evenly across the buckets. Did either of your groups do something really different?
Well, I would say that in group 4, can you are you sharing the screen or should I? Yeah. So we had a lot of discussion about education. Well, first of all, about government. It's not really different, but somewhat different. So that's what I want to address. Mm-hmm. At first, we weren't clear whether we should give discussion of what does government need the money for, which level of government. We talked a lot about that because this is a city. And so we talked about local government, but we're so used to thinking about federal government. So we agreed all levels of government need that, especially for coordination among the different levels of government. We didn't get into the nitty-gritty. Of course, we would need to, but it was a rich discussion about what is government needed for, what would government spend it on. And so that would be the first bucket. So we selected the priorities, as you see here: health and all policies, community advisory group for a master group plan, very important, and for the needs assessment. We just put 3 from each. We had some interesting discussions under bucket 3, education. And we were in agreement with the other groups that education is important. And I'll be honest, I was the one who raised it. I teach nursing. And we talked about how K through 12 is not enough, that you hope that K through 12 provides the foundation to more informed, involved, and civic-minded citizens, people later on. But that it's different. For example, I have to go back, teaching healthcare professionals, they forget what they learned. Hopefully they would know it better with this new type of initiative. But they need to understand how to use this knowledge to work with groups, patient groups, for better health and health care. So it's different from K through 12, but we talked about the need for this in higher education, which so far hasn't been discussed a lot. And so that as people mature, they think about this in a more, as voters, as members of a society that's different from just learning about it in a classroom. For bucket 4, civil society, and I was looking over, we really want to go back to the ethnic diversity of the city, and we want to have groups that represent the diversity of the city. But as I looked at this, and that would include interfaith groups, et cetera, there are groups that would be in a city or a town or Irelandia that are not mentioned here and that are marginalized. And so I'll take the liberty of being the rapporteur for this group to say the LGBTQ groups, the immigrant groups, religious groups, all kinds of groups. So just to go by ethnicity alone, as you've given us the social demographic, age is not depicted here in any kind of way. And so it would be important that to really be comprehensive and embrace wide groups. I want to point out that when you talk under bucket 3 and you had school boards and PTA, I'm sorry, I've done some of this work. The PTA is a very selective group of people who have time to work on PTA, and they're not necessarily the working parents and the majority of many cities. So the PTA would not be a group, but somehow to reach communities, whether it's through community activism, election politics, civic politics, bottom up, but school boards and schools, to tell you the truth, in my work with them, they're often considered the problem and not the solution. So I just editorialized there for my group. And okay, through that enough. So anybody, I think that's about all I want to say in the interest of time, not to want to repeat what the other groups have said.
Did you have any outliers? I'm just curious. I mean, again, you're taking an approach that it looks like the other groups that have reported thus far took. They're spreading the money for some similar reasons, but distinct reasons. Were there any disagreements in your group? Any outliers? Any strong arguments against this approach?
Not strong arguments. It took us a long time, and that's why we're late doing this, because we talked a lot about what does it mean to fund government agency coordination. And so in the interest of time, we said, okay, we can all go along with this. But we really debated what each of these things, especially government agency coordination, we were like, why are we giving them government money? This is their job. What will they do that makes a difference? And all these different levels of government. Okay, there needs to be someone who coordinates, an entity that coordinates, but how to make it meaningful we talked about that quite a bit. So there was a lot of discussion about government as the one that would be, what does it mean to have government, to give the government $2 million? Which government, what are they going to do with it? Don't they have money to do this? We talked about that.
Yeah, which I think was raised by one of the other groups,
Yeah.
some ambiguity about what do we really mean by government agency coordination. Yeah. You're bringing in a new dimension, just noting the various levels of government. So that's a really good point, something to understand. Okay, so Zoe, I think that you are our fifth group, and we need to hear from you. Are you ready to report out?
I am. Is my audio all right?
Yes, we can
Great.
hear you clearly.
So I am happy to present, and I'm going to do the best in that I've just tried to, for brevity, just create some kind of like a key word that I hope will kind of create a capsule of this summary for our group. So for bucket one on government agency coordination, what emerged in all of our thinking was really about the best use of our, in terms of our average here, we came to about $2 million. And so we think the best use here in terms of our government capacity is around data. So making sure that we're clear on what our outcomes, our measures, and being able to, I would also imagine in this application, evaluation of our strategies. The tension here was also around resolving, do we really want to build lots of government and staff capacity, or is it really important for us to direct as much of this $10 million pot to community? In terms of our community media, everything was really around innovation. So in rethinking and stepping out of the typical orientation that we are very much in, to have a broadband or online media-centered approach. We thought of other things, specifically like leveraging existing resources on AM or FM radio. One example might be sponsoring opportunities on public radio. So that's another way to kind of, and they have this matching kind of opportunities, rethinking snail mail. One thing that I'm aware of is that it has a 20 to 25% action rate. So it can actually, so in thinking of as we want, what we want to get out of our resident and communities engagement with these funds. And then also supporting journalistic norms. So it may not necessarily be that we need to have every language or every, kind of ethnic or demographic represented in a media product, but maybe the existing media core can unlearn certain practices or possibly be introduced to the solutions-oriented journalism methodology. For education, we were slightly different. It was our most funded area, but much of our ideas came into the unlearning. So centering around unlearning biases, unlearning racism, unlearning xenophobia, or unlearning, our approach to cognitive or physical normalities. And then finally, when it came to civil society, here much of our ideas, because there was a tension in the transformative versus the transactional, But it all came down to, we really wanted to address the groundwater. And I'm borrowing this from the Racial Equity Institute. So is it the fish, is it the lake, or is it the groundwater? And that's where we're thinking of, it's really the groundwater. So we went, we thought about the issues that continue to plague our country, from Manifest Destiny to Jamestown and before. So we are going pre-colonial and really acknowledging that much of this is really embedded in our fabric, and we've got to turn the clock back. But within all of this, it's centered around healing and addressing the trauma of, past uses of policy instruments and public dollars.
Great report. So it's, again, we have education as the big winner there, and it sounds like there was pretty much consensus around that in your group. Did I hear you say that, or was there any distraction from that?
I think that we were all really in a place of dissection. So it wasn't that I think that we were all very much in a place of we were very much in a place of critique of what is the current normative crisis, right, for each of the buckets. And so, but we were all very much aligned in that it needed to be funded. I think maybe where we had some of the widest range in our funding approach was around civil society. But overall, I think that the spirits were aligned of what needs to be. So the amounts were slightly different, but in terms of the interventions, they were all very much the same.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, as you all, you're already speaking to important values, as have all the repertoires in terms of equity and fairness, and you're using the language of healing. Were there other values? And this is really a question to all of the groups. Were there values in your view that sort of surfaced, or forms of just reasons or beliefs that you noted were particularly salient in sort of driving the discussion and how people allocated their resources? And I would say, Zoe, let's begin with you, and as others of the repertoires have ideas about that, just unmute yourselves.
Sure. I will say for Group 5, one thing that I think was pretty consistent overall is that in this community-based capacity orientation, so acknowledging that the solutions are within the community. And so that's, I think, one reason where our strongest alignment was in that the least funded category. Well, they're a tie, but I'll say government for purposes of this argument, is that it's really ensuring that most of our money went to the right of the fulcrum and not to the left. So.
Got it. Interesting. Madeline, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to, and Sophia, do you guys want to get in here and speak to some of the underlying reasons and values that motivated the discussion and were prominent?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Zoe said. It's very, I think we did mention yesterday that that power is important, and we also wanted to give power to the community to make a change in the way that they interact with each other, and in the way that certain organizations play a role in the community as a whole. And so that's why for most of our discussion, we were less focused on government agencies and government coordination, and we ended up funding it to be sort of a framework for the other buckets and dimensions. But I think the one value that we focused on is that we wanted change and more support to just shake off the way that our some of these infrastructures are run. So, yeah.
Great. Any comments from the other groups on this particular point?
I mean, Madeline kind of said it perfectly at the end. We were really just focused on transformational change. What category is going to make the most change? Because we know that they're all important. And as I mentioned, like when I was giving my report, like we know that they're all interconnected. So which category do we think can be the most radical, can like add the most back to society? Mm-hmm. And that's really where the best conversation came in, was because I think we all saw value in all the buckets. But that was mainly what we had focused on,
Right.
was just what can give the most change for society.
Right. Now, I'm noticing in the chat box, Zoe, there's a Karthik is asking me to ask a follow-up question specifically to you, Zoe, which is to give the context of your role being in local government now and how these conversations are timely and important, especially given ARPA funding. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I'm from Buncombe County, which is in Western North Carolina. You may be familiar with Asheville. And so tonight we will actually, our county commissioners will be voting on our budget. And related, our community declared racism a public health and public safety crisis last year. And then we were also one of the first Southeastern jurisdictions to have community reparations as in our city and then also in our county. Tonight, they should be adopting our racial equity action plan. And so it's really timely, as right now we've got about $50 million in ARPA funds. And on Thursday, we'll be having a community info session, as 25 million of that is open for community to present proposals. So it's all very timely this week. And so this was just we've been steeped in all of this. What does community want to do? And then how can we also support?
Great. Thank you for that context. It's inspiring to hear. So I want to go back, if I could. First, let me just ask, as you all have listened to one another report out, have things occurred to you that are important points you want to make, hearing your fellow rapporteurs describe the discussion and kind of the cadence of those conversations? Anything anybody want to add? Sally?
Well, I'm just thinking about things that we hadn't thought, that our group had not thought about, and of cross-cutting themes here. So two things come to mind. One is this issue of universal versus targeted, which is always, it's been with us for decades in trying to make policies. And I think it would be interesting to look at the evidence on that and see what it shows. So, for example, Medicare is universal. Anybody who's eligible gets it. And the elderly have done very well by that. A targeted one, means tested, all that brings in so many problems. So I'm intrigued by that question very, very much. And the other one is the notion of, when our group spoke, I think I accepted some of the norms of the institutions and the structures in society. And what I heard from some of the other speakers is the importance of not accepting them and going back to roots, to history, to culture, values, and questioning those norms and institutions. And I think that I thank those groups for making that point, because they're so important. And so how to do that in a meaningful way is what I think about. And it's not tearing down what we have, but really questioning them and bringing in new perspectives in order to do this and not just do the same old.
Thank you for that really important insight, Sally. I appreciate your sharing it. I just want to check in because we need to wrap up here in about 3 minutes. And I just want to make sure, I'm noticing that there's something in the chat about Q&A from the webcast page. I don't know if we can get to those comments from your small group colleagues who are now joining us, but joining us by way of the webcast. And I suspect that there's not. So let me just say how impressed I am with the discussions that you had. I've been doing democratic deliberation now for 10 or 12 years, and I always learn so much from the people who agree to dig in and talk with one another. And I just want to point out something. One of the most, there are a lot of different values, democratic norms, tenets to this form of democratic talk, if you will. But one of the goals is that people will learn from one another. And I've witnessed that today. It seems that in your small groups, you really listen to one another and learn from one another. And even as we've done our sort of sharing across the city councils, if you will, there's been learning that's happening there. And you know, perhaps I'm just a sunny optimist, but I just think that if we could have more structured discussion like this on the basis of good information, that maybe we'd have less polarization and more common ground or more civic connections. So I want to thank you all again for agreeing to be a part of these small groups, these mini deliberations, and thank you for your important insights. And with that, I think we're moving to Ray Baxter, the co-chair of this, who's going to make some concluding remarks.